Good afternoon, and welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum on this, the federal celebration of George Washington's birthday that has become, for many people, President's Day. I'm pleased you could join us. I'm Tom Schwartz, the Library Museum Director. If you were a first-time visitor to the United States, you might have the impression that this federal holiday does little more than promote the sale of cars, mattresses, furniture, and other assorted consumer items. But it is really a time to reflect on the founding and continued preservation of our nation. George Washington had the unique distinction of setting the model for the office of president. Without any precedence or history to guide him, Washington carefully thought about the powers of the president prescribed in the Constitution. He governed at a time of great political upheaval, as elected officials were trying to figure out the meaning of constitutional authority and the limits it set on actions of Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, and the states. The notion of extending Washington's birthday to reflect upon the history of the presidency is based upon other individuals who held the office. Lincoln is a prime example, who faced similar grave challenges to whether the ideals and system of a democratic republic might survive. Whether you choose to limit your reflections to George Washington, and today is also National Cherry Pie Day, or the broader presidency, which might include gooseberry pie, this is the day to do it. We're extremely fortunate to have Matthew Schaefer offer his own reflections on Herbert Hoover and food relief during World War I. Matt, as many of you know, is one of our senior archivists at the Hoover. He began his studies at Mount Union College and then went on to achieve ABD status at the University of Michigan, where he began researching a dissertation on the cultural conceptions of physical fitness in America from 1890 to 1940. During this time, he claimed to have stumbled into the archives profession, working at the Bentley Historical Library in Ann Arbor. He then worked at the State Historical Society of Iowa, while his wife, Karen Mason, worked as the curator of the Iowa Women's Archives. The last 14 years, Matt has been at the Hoover Library, assisting researchers in the use of archival collections. His knowledge of the holdings is invaluable, and he can direct researchers to specific collections of interest, saving valuable research time. He can also advise them if their research topic is beyond the scope of our holdings. Beyond Matt's encyclopedic knowledge of the collections and the Hoover story, he has an aptitude for number crunching and calculating large sets of numbers in his head. In part, he can tell you the baseball stats for the Cleveland Indians team and individual players in any given year. He has a great sense of humor, something not often found in the archival profession, where it is usually filed away. An example of Matt's dry wit occurred when a representative from OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was on site to perform a review. Matt was showing the individual around the research room when the OSHA official asked what serious health and safety issues were faced by archivists. Matt jokingly replied, "Well, paper cuts can be bloody." Raleigh Owens, our facility manager, gave Matt a look indicating he said the wrong thing. Later, Raleigh came back to explain the OSHA officials have no sense of humor, and the fellow wrote it down as a finding. Matt is also our health and wellness champion for our facility, being the most physically fit individual on stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matt Schaefer.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Tom. I didn't know as a senior archivist whether I should just hobble up. And you said I was fit, so I should bound up. It's so good to look out and see so many friendly faces and people I know in the audience. I've said to a couple of you, I'm going to talk about Hoover, food relief, and World War I. And I've said to a couple of you, if I veer off track, correct me. So, you know, I'm looking at you, Dick, if I start to drift. I know that many of you already know aspects of the Hoover story, but allow me to rapidly bring everyone else up to speed here. Hoover was born here in West Branch, 1874, orphaned at an early age, lives in Oregon for his teen years, goes to Stanford to study geology, comes out and makes his way through the world as a mining engineer. In his career as a mining engineer, he does quite well for himself. He travels the world, finds the richest gold mine in Australia, finds the richest gold and nickel mine in the Soviet Union, finds the richest silver mine in Burma, finds the deepest coal vein in China. He has an aptitude for this. And because of that, he becomes a self-made millionaire. One of his college classmates writes him in 1910, one of my favorite letters in our collection. He says, "Bert, old boy, it is rumored you're worth $10 million. Is that possibly true?" And Bert writes back, "Ben, my friend, no one our age could be worth $10 million, honestly. I am worth but $5." Which is a great Hoover story, reflects Hoover's very subtle humor, and appeals to me because it's got numbers in it and a dry sense of humor. Hoover is, in 1914, on the cusp of a decision. He's deciding, does he want to continue being this mining engineer, this world traveler, this man of considerable means, or does he want to get into another game? And he writes to one of his college friends, and this letter actually works its way up to David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford. He says, I'm tired of this game of making money. I know how to do it. I've accumulated enough chips. I'd like to get into a bigger game, the bigger game of public service. And David Starr Jordan actually takes this to heart and writes to President Taft in 1912, "If you have a job in public service, I've got a man named Hoover who might serve you." Nothing came of that. And ultimately what happens is Hoover doesn't so much find public service as public service finds him. He, his wife, and 2 kids are living in London in August 1914. War breaks out. The first war in Europe for about 40 years. Unlike the 1870 war between Germany and France, this one is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more bloody. And what it does to about 112,000 Americans trapped in, or traveling within Europe, it leaves them on the wrong side of water when the war breaks out. They're in Europe when they would very much like to be in America, but things have gone all a crupper. You know, the shipping is interdicted. There's a British blockade going up. Banks have closed. There's no ready access to resources. And Hoover, based in London, organizes the American Residence Committee for War Relief and gets about 40,000 people safe passage home between August 10th and September 24th. While he's doing that, Mrs. Hoover, who we see here, is working with the Resident American Women's Relief Committee, working along the same lines to get American citizens home and out of harm's way, basically get them as far away from the European war as possible. And that begins to wind down early October 1914, and Hoover begins to say, well, now it's time to pick up my, the burdens I've laid down, my public service here is done, I'll go back to my mining career. What he learns in this 6-week interval is a couple of principles that are going to serve him through his later relief efforts. He organizes this as a citizen-led voluntary relief organization, sets up a clear chain of command, sets up a constitution and bylaw, even though he knows this is going to be a short-lived organization. He wants it understood who's doing what, when, and why. Hoover being Hoover, sets up a decision tree that leads to a pyramid with him at the top as the head decision maker. You'll see this show up again and again in Hoover's life. And he sets up, when he distributes responsibilities and duties, he holds people accountable. If you're going to volunteer for the job, you better be able to do the job. If not, boom, you're gone, and you're replaced with somebody who can. These things will show up in Hoover's life when he finds the next step in his public service. You wouldn't think I'd be able to get 4 pages out of Word if I did. I'm an archivist. I'm just not a very good one. In mid-October 1914, Hoover is approached by Walter Hines Page, the American ambassador in London, who says, we have a problem in Belgium. The country, okay, the way the war played out in Belgium. Germany invades France. Rather than going directly to France while they share a border, they take the indirect route because the direct route is blocked by the Maginot Line. They go through Belgium. Belgium, who's been neutral for 100 years, is not suited or in any way, shape, or form to stop the racing of the German army. They capitulate in a matter of weeks. They are under siege. They are under the German jackboot by October. And the Germans, as their as any warring nation is wont to do, requisition the food in the fields. Basically, harvested the Belgian crops for their own troops and for shipment back to Germany. This left the Belgians in a bit of a sticking point. Belgium, a highly industrialized nation of about 8 million people, imported 80% of its food before the war, and would have to continue to import 80% of its food throughout the war. But with their crops gone, the German army in the field, and a British blockade in the seas between them and any hope of food, they were looking at starvation within a matter of 3 weeks in the cities and a matter of months in the countryside. The American ambassador in London calls Hoover. He's getting these reports from Belgium. He says, I need your help. And Hoover says the 3 most compelling words in the English language, can I help? He lays down his burdens again. He's in London. He's called on to help, organizes the CRB basically on the fly, sets it up as a voluntary organization run with Americans to do the fundraising and handle the logistics of getting food from basically Atlantic states, from Argentina, from Canada, from the US, into Europe, and leaves the organization of food distribution in Belgium to Belgians and neutral citizens, the Dutch, the Danish, the Swedes, the Swiss. Hoover knew that this is going to be a tricky operation. No one's ever done this kind of thing before. So he almost immediately says, I know my leverage here as a private citizen is going to be minimal, meeting with the head of state, because they can just close the door on me. What I have to do is mobilize world opinion, hit him with a club of public opinion. So he immediately sets up a propaganda unit, organizes people to do clippings and to sort of champion the need of poor Belgium, overrun by a hostile nation, innocent Belgium, needing the help of the world. This cable here is one of his early cables sent to California. Even on this screen, it's hard to read, but basically he's saying the people of Belgium face a grim situation. This is late October 1914. The cities have 1 to 3 weeks of food. The only people who can answer this problem, who can address this issue, are Americans. Please help. We're talking about a nation of 7 to 8 million people, and all of them need to be fed. I mean, when Hoover starts, he's thinking this might be a 6-week to 6-month operation. If we can get them to next summer's harvest, then we can disband the CRB. We don't have to really worry about its enduring impact. By then, the war will either be over or food supplies will be set up. But in the meantime, we're going to set up our own flag, our own ships. Like I said, hundreds of American volunteers, thousands of volunteers on the ground in Belgium. Because in Belgium, in November 1914, there are bread lines. This is a picture I think many of you have seen if you've been to the Hoover Library. This little girl eating a hunk of bread. This is among the first shipments of bread to Belgium. It's a PR photo taken and used in a later book called War Bread. And Hoover uses, shamelessly uses kind of PR. These, kids are starving. Here's a bread line with a couple of hundred Belgian women standing in line for bread. He understands this is it's an enormous problem, and it's not just charity. It's feeding and watering a whole nation. He uses publicity to good effect. He's able to shame leaders of state, especially in France and in Great Britain, to make contributions. Most of the first 2 years' funding is done by nation states, not by individual donations. It's not until the third year that individual donations really begin to take off. We're talking about a huge need. When they started, the Belgians and Hoover thought maybe $1 million worth of food a month. They missed by a factor of 10. And that was by early 1915. And as the war went on, the need got greater. And by the end of the war, they were moving $17 million worth of food a month. What it amounted to was the CRB was a huge transnational non-government organization that ultimately had $1 billion pass through its hands between 1914 and 1919 when it disbanded. $1 billion. I mean, it's $1 billion nowadays. It's probably in your pocket if you look. But $1 billion in 1914 and 1919 is a stack of money. It's somewhere between 20 and 25 billion in today's dollars, which I can't think of any aid program operating right now that's operating with a budget like that. And Hoover's doing it with private citizens, voluntary organization, and running it. He knows it has to be more blameless than Caesar's wife, has to account for every nickel, can't be seen to be profiting from this. And they run it where 99% of the money that comes in is directly accountable, spent on food, on clothes, on shipping, on the needs, to meet the needs of the Belgians. Challenges. Hoover is on the ground. He spends most of 1915 and 1916 in Europe, bouncing from Paris to London to Berlin to Brussels to Bern, spends some time in Denmark, trying to hammer out safe passage for the people who volunteer for the CRB, arguing that it's a mission of mercy. We have no stake in this war. We're not trying to help the Germans or the British. We are just trying to feed the Belgians. And he's able to thread that needle, but it calls for constant attention on his part and constant renegotiating sort of the rules of engagement. By the summer of 1915, when he's basically, the CRB is running at full tilt, there are about 170 Americans, and what they get on their second day on the job is a 25-page handbook, how to behave as a CRB representative, 25 pages explaining the do's and don'ts of a neutral citizen of a private citizen from a neutral nation. And if you messed up on that, you were bounced. There were people in the CRB who were alleged to be spies. I mean, the Germans were quite suspicious of these do-gooders. What are they doing behind our lines? And are they moving information as well as food? And if Hoover had any questions about your integrity, about you leaning one way or the other, you were gone. He sent you back stateside. On the other hand, if he believed in you, he would stand with you to the final ditch. Joe Green, who was one of the many college students who volunteered for Hoover, was accosted and held for being a German spy. And he's 22 years old. He's pretty anxious. This is not what he had signed up for. And Hoover says, you take that back. You cut him loose and you give him back his dignity, issue a public apology, or I'm taking the CRB apart. He threatened that 12 times. And after he showed how effective it was in delivering food to people, neither the Germans nor the British would call his bluff on that. Many of you have done tours of Hoover. Know Hoover was a card player later in life. Here, he would have been a kick-ass poker player. Not canasta, but poker. He was not afraid to go beyond his, basically put everything at risk. Thanks from Belgium. This was an unprecedented food relief effort, the largest in history to that date, and the citizens of Belgium were enormously grateful. They understood how precarious their position was in the fall of 1914 and what the CRB meant to their continued existence as a nation. And schools, citizens, churches sent him notes of thanks, sent him these little photos, school photos showing the kids being, kids healthy. I'll read a quote from the War Bread book, which was a fundraising tool that Hoover used in 1915 to 16. It tells the story of Edward Eyre Hunt, who worked for relief in Antwerp, a personal narrative of war and relief, the feeding, clothing, housing, and employment of millions of Belgians. This book is for sale. It's a fundraising tool. And the part that Hoover didn't want in the book, but that Hunt insisted on, were the letters from Belgian children. Hoover thought this was pandering and thought this was just a little bit inappropriate, a little too far over the line. But Hunt said, no, this is going to sell the book, and he's right. Dear America, thank you, because you sent great big boats over the great seas. Eat boats, rice, corn, bacon, stockings, clothing, and shoes. I know that you like the little Belgians, and I like you too. I often saw Mother weep when we came downstairs in the morning, because she could not give us the bread we asked for, because there was no flour. But you have dried her tears with the good flour which you have sent. And that was a letter that was taken verbatim from one of the kids' letters. And War Bread sold tens of thousands of copies, raised in the low $10,000s of dollars. The other note of thanks for Hoover, as anyone who's gone through the museum has seen, flour sacks. Now, Hoover's not a very sentimental guy. He doesn't have a lot of keepsakes from early in his life. He traveled the world as a mining engineer. Our museum collection documenting his early years didn't come from the Hoovers by and large. It came from people who knew the Hoovers and from other sources. But the flour sacks, the 400 or so that we have in our collections here, come directly from the Hoover family. The Hoovers kept them. I don't know if they kept every single one, but they kept 400 of them and preserved them, displayed them in their home in Stamford after the war, because these artifacts had deep symbolic and deep meaning for the Hoovers. They were imbued with so much meaning, and they're just beautiful to look at. Act 2. Hoover's operations with the CRB were predicated on him being a neutral citizen, a private citizen from a neutral nation. 1917, World War I is going in a different direction. The Germans, it's a war of stasis. It had been locked up in trench warfare for the better part of 18 months. The Germans realized, we're not going to win this war on the land. Let us expand the rules of warfare and engage in unrestricted submarine warfare. Let us just sink ships as they cross without giving them warning and having them surface and having innocent civilians get off. That was a fundamental shift. Hoover, given his position and who he's talking to in Europe, knows this is coming. So he leaves London in the middle of January 1917 and is heading to DC, where he can talk to Wilson and apprise him of this is coming. Before their meeting on February 1st, on January 31st, the Germans declare unrestricted submarine warfare. And Hoover realizes, well, my plan to raise money for the CRB may have to go on the back burner, because I may have to stay stateside and work here. Because he understands that if America enters the war, and it's not clear in February 1917 that they would enter the war, because Wilson had run on, he kept us out of war in 1916. But Hoover, seeing, using his vision into the future, said, I don't think there's any way America can stay out of this war given the situation as it's unfolding. And it does unfold that way. After unrestricted submarine warfare, we severed diplomatic ties. We about a month and a half of U-boats sinking ships, 15 to 20% of those crossing the Atlantic. America says, that's it. Wilson declares war April 6, 1917, coming up on a centennial. I'll be talking about this on April 6, on 2017. And Hoover is hoping that Wilson will contact him and say, I want you to be in charge of the food operations in America. Wilson and Hoover do a dance. I mean, he meets with Wilson in May. That's a month after the declaration of war. And even at that point, Wilson isn't ready to pull the trigger and say, okay, we're going to create a war cabinet level position called the U.S. Food Administration, you're going to be my man. That's what Hoover wants. He wants a U.S. Food Administration, he wants cabinet level authority, he wants to be the guy in control. And Wilson is saying, yeah, we've got this Secretary of Agriculture who thinks he's in charge of food supply in America. They don't want to step on his toes. And Hoover is just steaming because he knows the Secretary of Agriculture and doesn't see him as a first-rate man and doesn't see him as up to the task. But he's also a citizen, and if he's not going to take action if his president's not going to back him. Ultimately, Wilson sees the wisdom of Hoover's position and names him first the interim head of the Emergency Defense Committee, and giving him the responsibility for all emergency operations dealing with food and the war. This happens in mid-May 1917. And then in August 1917, with the Food Control Act, the Lever Act, creating the U.S. Food Administration, Hoover is finally situated where he wants to be, at the top of this voluntary organization, a businessman running the U.S. Food Administration. It's unique. There's a lot of things that happen in wartime that wouldn't happen in peacetime. A lot of consolidation of power. U.S. Food Administration is a great example of that sort of consolidation of power. But you can't, this is America, you can't create a food czar out of nothing. He has to walk that thin line, balancing the voluntary engagement of farmers, of housewives, of merchants, of millers, with the needs of shipping as much food as possible to Europe, while at the same time leaving enough food in America to feed its citizens. There's a lot going on, and here's where Hoover's technological grasp, his mind for numbers and logistics serves him well. He's able to walk that line. He's also clever enough to realize he's not going to be able to do this alone. He enlists the aid of some powerful men in the milling business in Minnesota, and he goes kind of outside the regular parameters of politics and enlists the aid of American women and housewives, because he knows that they control food in the house. And he says, I want you all to be members, volunteers with the U.S. Food Administration. So this little wheat ears and U.S. seal would be probably displayed in the front windows of women's homes as they were working with the U.S. Food Administration. Well, this is Hoover and his family in 1917, January when he comes back. They didn't meet him in May when he came back. The kids were in school. So he organizes, and Hoover's never really a guy for coining phrases, but here he breaks with the mold and he coins the phrase, food will win the war. It's the only phrase in the first, I'd say, 50 years of his life that is actually trenchant, that has oomph in 5 words or less. Because he understands food is a weapon. Food is necessary for the troops, it's necessary for civilians, and America has an enormous capacity to produce, and if we're wise, and judicious and eliminate waste and efficient in conserving food. We can ship enormous tonnages to Europe where it's going to be needed by troops and civilians over there. And he sets this up as a voluntary organization, county by county, state by state. There's a food administrator in each of the 48 states. There is a food administration office in all the county extension offices. He works through the U.S. Department of Agriculture there and uses extension officers to disseminate the message. And use corn, oat, potatoes, rye, eat poultry, eggs, game. The big things to save are wheat, meat, sugars, and cooking fats. That's what that ships best, and that's the most needed stuff in Europe. And I loved finding this little go back to the simple life. Be concerned with simple food, simple pleasures, and simple clothes. Work hard, pray hard, play hard. Do it all courageously. We have a victory to win. I mean, Hoover's kind of a hippie. He's a locavore before there's locavores. The picture here is kind of hard to see. This is Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia, and there's a banner across. This is the merchant district. It says "Food will win the war." Food fight on many fronts. Yeah. Yes, John Belushi, Animal House. Thank you. Back in history. He understands food has to be, we have to ramp up production. We have to get as many acres into wheat as possible. We have to make sure that we don't let that food go to waste in the field, that we harvest it promptly, that we're not wasting manpower by inefficient harvesting, that we're using all the machines efficiently. I'm a little bit out of my depth here, and I'm probably talking to people who have actually threshed and farmed. But in the 19-teens, there's the first wave of mechanized farming and grain threshing via machines. So there's a lot of sort of field-to-field, farm-to-farm threshing. And he says, let's make this efficient. Let's not be wasteful in how we do this. Works with again, millers and distributors to make sure nothing goes to waste, nothing is left uncovered as it's being transported. Encourages farmers to build silos in their fields so there's no waste in the fields. And again, focuses on a totally new audience, women and children, to conserve food. He develops, ideas to change people's diets, to reduce waste. Meatless Mondays, Wheatless Wednesdays were implemented first in October 1917. And then as the war went on, they just kept ramping up the wheatless and meatless meals and days until this is March 1918. And if you look at it here, Sunday, 1 meal wheatless, 1 meal meatless. Monday, all meals wheatless, 1 meal meatless. Go through the calendar here, the whole week. If there are 21 meals in a week, 19 are either wheatless or meatless or both. That's asking a lot of American families. And they contributed. American families jumped in with gusto. Everyone wanted to do their part. You know, it was part of a huge patriotic push, and we had buy-in. We see kids developing gardens. We see people digging up grass and planting potatoes, kind of like Russia today. Only when they're doing it in Russia today, they're doing it to make vodka. We didn't make vodka at that time. We have students and teachers organizing classroom activities, going door to door with pledge cards. That little U.S. Food Administration card, do your part, show that you're with us. Classes on how best to use clean garbage. Clean garbage was a concept that was foreign to me until I put this talk together. You know what clean garbage is? Garbage you can feed your pigs, so that your pigs can then be slaughtered and made into bacon and lard and ham. Again, a little Hoover the hippie, recycling his own little. creative in his approach. We see poetry, we see signage, we see songs. I will spare you singing the song, Thank You, Mr. Hoover. You'll thank me later. And then working with kids. The cartoons, Hoover invoked another phrase he turned to that I really liked, the gospel of the clean plate. I grew up with that gospel. Anybody else? You know, goes back to 1917, 1918. Do not waste food. It can be used by other people. This is a Valentine I couldn't resist. We're close to Valentine's Day. From February 1918 to my Valentine, I can Hooverize on dinner and on lights and fuel too, but I'll never learn to Hooverize when it comes to loving you. Indeed. And it's done by he works with the Motion Picture Association of America to make sure that all newsreels in front of all movies have a push for food conservation or for increasing food production. He has Minutemen and Minutewomen going out and giving public addresses, usually in movies. He organizes, he's got pushes to teachers, to ministers, to anybody in authority. And what's amazing to me is, as an archivist, a lot of this stuff still exists because he didn't resort to Twitter or Facebook or the internet, none of which was invented. He didn't use TV ads, again, not available to him, or the radio. Radio doesn't exist really nationwide until 1922. But he's able to get this message out, and most of it's on paper, and a lot of it's behind the doors in our stacks here. U.S. Food Administration is one of the, it's record group number 4 for the archivist in the family. It's got about 600 cubic feet of material in archives too. One of the big early collections in NARA. I don't often get a shout out to NARA. Food wins the war. Hoover's efforts, personalized it. Hoover and the Food Administration and the thousands of volunteers and the millions of families who worked with us doubled American food export, especially wheat, to Europe between 1917 and 1918. Doubled American meat export, almost tripled fat and sugar export. And it did it by conservation, by increasing production, and just by getting everybody, to pull on their oar and to carry their share. Oh yeah, and guns. Guns help too. But Hoover recognizes, even as the war is winding down, that's not it. That's not the end of the story, because there's going to be chaos after the war. Hunger is going to haunt Europe. He's in Europe enough in the summer and fall of 1918 to realize that Romania, Russia, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Finland, all the Slavic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are not going to be able to feed themselves until at least 1919. And he says to Wilson, okay, we might win this war in the battlefield and then lose it to socialism and chaos if we don't get food to these nations. We have to move, and we have to move fast. And Wilson, to his credit, understands, yes. And he says, hunger does not breed reform, it breeds madness and makes ordered life impossible. Okay, World War I quiz. When did World War I end?
1919.
November 11th, 1919. I have in my hands a memo that Hoover wrote to Wilson, November 9th, 1918, just before the war ends. And he says, in the matter of feeding liberated people of Austria, Serbia, Bulgaria, Turkey, etc., I have had conferences with staff members, and I propose to you the following measures. That the Army should take charge of the ships, that in order to secure this organization, we should have the U.S. Food Administration, or an agency like it, set up to control food production in America and distribution to Europe, and it appears to me that I should be the one to take charge of that. You gotta love Hoover's planning. He's out in front. Those of you, who know me, I have many favorite documents. This is on my list now. Just because he's able to see over the horizon and say, yeah, we can solve that problem. We can win the war, and then lose the peace if we don't keep these people fed, and lose the peace if we don't keep Germany solid. His big, for Hoover, the big threat was no longer Germany in 1918. It was Russia. The Russian Revolution had transpired, and Lenin was in charge there. So once again, Wilson, he's a politician, and he's a politician and a constitutional scholar, so he's always waiting for Congress to act. He understands that as president, his job is to sign legislation and have laws passed that way, not to do executive orders. And he kept waiting for Congress to act, and Congress dilly-dallied, and he finally said, I'm going to do an executive order. February 24th, 1919, he does an executive order and gives Hoover what he wants in terms of making the U.S. Food Administration the basis for the American Relief Administration in Europe. Again, Wilson is convinced by Hoover's arguments, understands that the peril in Europe is real, is immediate, and we're talking again about dealing with logistical problems, about getting food from America, this time not just to Belgium and Western Europe, but all the way into the, deep, deep into Russia. We're talking hugely long, it's probably 6 weeks from America, 6 days from America to Falmouth, England. But then it's another 6 days to get it to here where it can be distributed. And when we're talking about food, 6 days, 12 days, 18 days, depending on where you are at in the starvation cycle, that can make a difference. And again, one man to take this job, one man to manage it, it's Herbert Hoover. And he does it again, recognizing that America's done their part for the war. They've won the war. Now, how do we win the peace? And he develops all kinds of new ideas to get money directly to people in need. This food package here, for $10, you can send 117 pounds of food to an individual or to a specific city in Europe. What a brilliant idea. It's earmarked foreign aid. And we're talking, America at this time, there's a lot of Polish Americans, there's a lot of Serbian Americans, there's a lot of hyphenated Americans who still have family back in Warsaw, back in Srebrenica, back in Austria. This is a way to get buy-in. And for $10 is, I don't want to say it's a small sum, but it's not a staggering sum. And it's kind of sum that people can kick in. Another one of his clever ideas was the Invisible Guest Program, where you could, and that's the certificate here, basically conserve food at your table for one invisible guest and donate that food to Europe where it was needed. All right, I've taxed your patience as long as I dare. Summary. In the space of 8 years here, Herbert Hoover led 2 of the largest food relief efforts in history. And at that time, they were the 2 largest to date. The CRB and then the American Relief Administration. CRB fed between 8 and 10 million, 1914 to 19. The American Relief Administration fed between 20 and 40 million between 1919 and 1922. Sets as president of voluntary organizations. This voluntarism is going to be his model of solving problems into the future. Nominated for the Nobel Prize. Did not win, but nominated twice for these efforts. And he started off on the slippery slope of public service in 1914. Never got off that slope. He ends up in public service for the rest of his life. Thank you.
If you have a question for Matt, just raise your hand. I'll pass you the mic, and you could ask your question.
And I'll ask more specifically later, but I'd love to see a couple of those documents you mentioned.
Oh, sure. I was crazy math. I thought, oh, only 6 people will come to this, and we'll do it in the reading room, and I'll just bring out boxes and show you what I was talking about. But anybody who wants to look at documents
Yeah.
can do so by getting a library research card. It's as simple as getting a library card for the West Branch Public Library. How easy is it? You have one, Dick, don't you? Lauren has one. Brian has one. Is that Patrick? Yeah. Who else? Oh, Sue has one. I didn't give him one. So when he signs in, he signs in as the man with no card. Right.
One thing you barely touched on, but it's fascinating to me, if you could speak more to some of the politics of dealing with these foreign leaders and within the CRB itself, and kind of conflictual interest, and how he navigated that.
That is a question that George Nash answered in about 300 pages in his book.
I'll read it.
I would defer to George because it's thorny, it's complicated, and all I know is that Hoover had certain personality problems with individuals that, he had to work with, but he found it difficult to work with them. But he found enough people to work with, enough workarounds on the German side and on the British side. I mean, like Churchill didn't help Hoover at all, but he had ways to work around him. I'm sorry, I'm gibbering. He was able to find folks who would get the job done. Jerry. I'm sorry. Jerry, your arms aren't that long.
I was just kind of wondering, like, future famines and stuff in the future, do a lot of organizations, do they copy what he did?
Yes, that's a very good question. The CRB and the ARA become models for food relief organizations through the 20th century. UNICEF draws heavily on the ARA, including the people that headed UNICEF worked for the ARA. So there's a direct lineage. You can just take, you can just walk it back. And historians who study it are making that point. But it's only 3 historians who study it and not getting heard. Good people, but it's a small audience for Hoover and food relief in World War I. This may be the most people to see Hoover and food relief in World War I since a while. Yes, Jerry.
Matt, you mentioned that I think it was Woodrow Wilson, when Hoover approached him about the food relief and before the Food Administration, about a Department of Agriculture secretary that Hoover didn't feel up to the job. Who was that? Do you recall?
Henry Wallace.
No. It wasn't Henry Wallace. It was the guy before Henry Wallace. I'm sorry, Jerry. The name's eluding me. Just Hoover thought he was small bore, and he was right. Damn. I'm sorry.
Did Hoover also organize to feed the countries after World War II?
Yes. That was Sue's question was, did Hoover organize food relief after World War II? Yes, he did. The Famine Emergency Committee, I kind of felt like I was running out of time there. Turns out Hoover, after World War II, is called in by Truman, just like Wilson called him in World War I. And Truman says, what's the world going to be like months from now? And Hoover says, you're going to have an impending problem if you don't get food, and a lot of food, into the nations that are going to end up behind the Iron Curtain. And if you don't get food into Eastern and Western Europe, more countries are going to fall to communism. He spends most of the spring and early summer 1946 flying national capital to national capital, assessing food needs, and again, organizing food relief, this time for 400 million. Gets nominated for the Nobel Prize for that one, too.
Were there any of the CRB ships that were attacked even though they were marked?
Yes. 3 or 4, I think, went down.
And my second question is that book Warbread in the gift shop here for sale?
It's not in the gift shop here now. No,
Okay.
it's
Can
out
it
there.
be purchased yet?
If you go to ABE, American Book Exchange, I've seen it out there, and it's more than $2.10 now. Last I looked, it was, I think, $4 or $5.
The logistics of shipping all of that food into Russia and across Europe. I was reading one biographer that talked about how some French leaders said, well, we have to rebuild the railroads and canals, and Hoover said, I've been shipping on that canal for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about his logistic background as a mineralogist and engineer that led to this relief effort?
Where do I start with this? He found the richest and deepest coal mine in China, hundreds of miles inland, not quite to the desert, but almost to the desert, the Gobi. And he had a rail line built to that. The silver mine in Burma crossed three watersheds and 2 mountain ranges. So he was used to solving these problems as a mining engineer. He built a port in Burma, big enough to have decent-sized cargo ships get in and out because it was just more efficient. So he knew enough. He had enough people on the ground locally, and he knew who to trust locally to know where when the rail lines would be open. The canals, they opened and closed because it didn't take much to close the canal. You dump some rocks in and you got to get them out. But he was able. He seemed always to be ahead of the curve in information, and it's part of his business training. No verbal orders. Everything had to be written, and so there was accountability all the way up and down the line that way too. So if somebody told him that that canal was open or that train route, that train, those rails were open, and it wasn't, he could go back through the files and say, George, we got some explaining to do. Yes.
You talked about his relationship with Wilson.
Mhm.
How about other U.S. presidents? I know FDR pretty well shunned him, I think.
Later in life, actually, Hoover knew Teddy Roosevelt, he knew Taft, obviously worked closely with Wilson. 1932-33, Hoover and FDR couldn't be any more diametrically opposed. But in 1920, FDR writes to Hugh Gibson, who was a former ambassador to Belgium, and says, that Hoover guy would be a great candidate for president as a Democrat. And Gibson shares this little note with Hoover saying, what do you think? And Hoover kind of, well, I suppose I should reply. And he writes this really clever reply. He says, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not a member of your tribe. Just that is one of the earliest letters we have between Hoover and Roosevelt. Obviously, as time unfolded, they couldn't stand each other.
Come back in June. There's that event in June.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. Lynn Smith, Lynn is an archivist here and also my memory buffer. We will be having a symposium in June where George Nash, Tim Walsh, Lisa Ocean, and Richard Norton Smith will be here, and Ross Kennedy will be here to talk about Hoover and his relationship with different presidents. Richard Norton Smith will, I think, do the whole shoot and match.
Kennedy
That's what
will
he
do
does.
Wilson.
Kennedy will do Wilson.
George will do Coolidge. Lisa Truman and Tim Eisenhower.
Eisenhower. Leaving Kennedy undone. But there's an interesting story there too.
Do you have a date?
June 2nd?
June 2nd. Thank you, Jerry. Okay, at this point, my blood sugar is going down and my memory is just getting a little sketchy.
The keynote will be by Richard Norton Smith on Friday, and then Saturday will be the 4 speakers talking about Hoover's relationship with the specific president. I think the dinner will be out at the Brown Deer Country Club. And then the conference will be here. And I think we're trying to see if we can plan a lunch. If you want to just stay on site, you can pitch a tent up at the Yellow House and have lunch and then come back for part 2 of that conference.
And as somebody who just leaned heavily on George Nash for my presentation, basically taking his 2 books and reducing it to a 40-minute talk, if you get a chance to hear George Nash talk, it's worth it. He's, honest to God, forgotten more about Herbert Hoover than the rest of us will ever know.
And I should state that this conference is in conjunction with the exhibit that we'll be running. It'll be C-SPAN's American Presidency. We'll not only have their temporary exhibit on each of the 45 presidents, they will have something on President Trump, but we will also have original artifacts to supplement their pictures and stories for each president. So that'll be a lot of fun. And that'll be in the temporary exhibit gallery, recording gallery.
Do you think C-SPAN would be here to record the keynote?
One would hope, since we're promoting
Yeah.
their exhibit, so we'll see.
I would encourage.
They've been very good.
They're pretty good about that.
Yeah.
They are.
I know they've been here before.
Mhm.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and let's give Matt a round of applause.